in front of the building TDB 803. The owner of the vehicle is reminded that it has to be moved ASAP or public safety will come and ticket you and possibly tow you if it is not moved. Again, that is a white Range Rover, South Carolina license plate TDB 803. Thank you. Okay, I know. Good morning, everyone. Please welcome Rusty Hughes, the 2022 CTAR Immediate Past President, to the stage.
Well, thank you for that smattering golf clap. A lot of energy behind that one. This is, I guess, how the past president gets treated amongst this group, but it's all good. Good morning. I'm excited to welcome everybody to the 2022 residential market update. Absolutely wonderful to see the attendance in person. And I also know that we have some of our members watching virtually, so I'd like to welcome them as well. Remind them that the camera adds 10 pounds. So I've been trying hard this year to lose that. But anyway, I am your immediate past president, and I serve as the RPAC committee chair this year. So if you haven't had an opportunity to stop by the RPAC booth outside, please do so and just get some information. Learn a little bit more about how you can invest in yourself and our profession. So at this time, I would like to introduce our 2022 CTAR president, Mr. John Stroud.
Thanks, brother.
All right, man.
Appreciate it.
Good luck.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you?
Good morning.
You can do better than that. How come we always have to ask you twice? I'm just kidding. Good morning.
Good morning.
There you go. Hey, a couple quick announcements before we get going. They've been making these announcements, but I want to make sure that you know this. There's a white Range Rover TDB 803. It's about to be towed to my house. They're going to deliver a new key. So if you don't want to lose your car to me, you need to go get it. Also, somebody dropped an earpiece. So this will cost you a referral fee at your next listing. No, I'm just kidding. But if this is your earpiece, I don't want you to miss that $1 million call. So please come up and get that. So, well, welcome to this residential market update for 2022. It's good to see everybody in the room. I know we had a group of several people who changed their in-person to online, so we welcome you all as well. We totally understand with what's been going on. So I'm excited to welcome you, and it's good to see all of you. I'm going to read this a little bit of this, so I appreciate you indulging me on that. Due to the rise in COVID cases, though, it is something that Trident Tech has asked us. We want to make sure that when you're in this room, please keep your mask on at all times unless you're eating or drinking. So if you would do that, that is a Trident Tech rule, and we want to make sure that we honor that. So thank you for that. We are also going to share the presentations in a follow-up email, and you'll also be able to find them on the website at charlestonrealtors.com and on our Facebook page. So you don't have to worry, like me, I was always the guy that was taking pictures of the slides. You don't have to worry about that. You can just enjoy. So you may have had a chance to mingle with many of the companies during our sponsor expo, but I'd like to specifically thank some of our 2022 annual sponsors. If you are here representing one of our bronze annual sponsor companies, will you please stand? Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I think they're all represented up here on the screen. If you are here representing one of our silver annual sponsor companies, please stand when I say your name. Ace Preferred Inspections, Ameris Bank, Angel Oak Mortgage Solutions, Benchmark Mortgage, Brightway Insurance, Citizens, Dallas Law Firm, Embrace Home Loans, Family First Funding, Guild Mortgage Company, Pulte Group, the Post and Courier, Radiant Home Inspections, Rev Federal Credit Union, and Resource Financial Services. Let's give them a round of applause. Round of applause, thank you. Silver sponsors. If you are here representing one of our gold annual sponsor companies, please stand when I say your name. Atlantic Coast Mortgage, right here in the back, there you go. And Premier Nationwide Lending, also in the back here. Thank you all. Thank you to our gold sponsors. If you're representing one of our platinum annual sponsors, please stand when I say your name. South Carolina Federal Credit Union, got a row right here in the front. The Suttles Law Firm, thank you all. And Nessen. Thank you to our platinum sponsors. Returning for the third year as our exclusive auto sponsor is Audi of Charleston. I hope everyone got a chance to see, especially the blue one out there. That was pretty nice looking, wasn't it? So the beautiful cars they had outside as you came in this morning. Will you all stand if you're here from Audi Charleston? Oh, right here in front. There you go. Thank you to Mr. Bill McDaniels and his entire team. We thank you for that. And finally, our presenting annual sponsor for the 10th year in a row is Weeks and Irvin. Mark, are you here that you can come up and... There he is, Mark. Come forward and say a few words. Mark's usually a really shy guy, so I'm really surprised he's rushing to the stage here.
I just want a couple things, guys. Most importantly, I want you guys to realize what all CTAR does for us. I think I call it CTAR. People don't like me calling it CTAR, but they do so much for us as a group. The training, the classes. I just want you guys to appreciate these guys. Rusty Hughes last year, John Stroud, got Corin Millette back there, Kimberly Lease, just to mention a couple of the past presidents. These people are giving up their time to make our industry great. And while they're not selling, they could be selling, they're actually helping you and I. So you don't forget these guys. That's a great group, CTAR. They're, like I said, it's just a wonderful crowd, and they do so much for our industry. So I just want you to remember that when you're, rustling around the contract, bitching about it, this, that, because I bitch about it all the time myself. They are actually working on making changes on that. So I just want you, don't forget about these guys and gals. It's a tough deal they're doing. They're volunteering. They don't get paid for it, but they've done a heck of a job, and they're making some good changes in the contract and things like that. Also, guys, it's so crazy out there right now. I do lien searches for you guys for free. Please take me up on those. I do about 1,000 a month, but I should be doing about 2,000 with some of the crap that's out there right now. Everybody's selling their crap now, guys. Their inventory's down. So if they're selling their crap, why don't you call me and get a lien search so I can tell you within like 2 or 3 hours that you got crap, and don't list it or don't make an offer on it. Kind of kidding, kind of not on the crap part, guys, but there is a lot of inventory that's gone. There's no inventory. I mean, like I said, everyone's just dumping everything, and every now and then I'll have you guys just throw it on the market. Hey, why don't you call me real quick, Mark M. Weeks at weekslawfirm.net, Charleston, Berkeley, Dorchester County. Doesn't cost you a dime. I don't usually know who you are, so you should get it back in 2 or 3 hours. If I do know who you are and I don't like you, you're probably not going to get it back for a couple days. There you go. Kind of kidding, kind of not. You know the deal? I know that guy. Oh, boy, he lost that. We lost that. We'll pick it up later. Just kidding. But the lien searches, guys, are free. Okay, they're free. They come directly to my email, and I just shoot them out to our abstractors. It's not a 40-year search, but it's going to tell you if you got crap, you got a crapper or not, okay? And I'd rather you know that in 2 or 3 hours than 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before closing, okay? So please do that. And also, guys, communicate, please. I know it's tough out there right now with all the craziness and everyone working remotely and things like that, but communicate with people, man. Pick up the phone and call people back. Email them back. If someone's calling you, call them back. That's one thing I will do. I'm going to call you back. I might call you back in the middle of the damn night, but I'm going to call you back. And every now and then you guys will hang up on me, and I'll at least say, well, I did call them back, and they do remember it. So, but with all that being said, guys, you guys have done a great job over the last 2 years. It has been exhausting. I am exhausted. I know you guys are too. I get some of the craziest calls. Y'all do too. But they are going to have a new course in CTAR this year, and I'm going to teach it. It's going to be on creativity. because you guys have become some of the most creative sons of guns I've ever met in my life. So we're gonna have a new course. I'm just kidding, it's not a new course. I was just making it up because some of the crap that I get from you guys is pretty crazy. I said, damn, that's pretty good. He or she did take the time to at least think this out. But again, just kind of kidding, kind of not. I want you to have some fun here today. I think the market's still great. Rates, if they go up, guys, who cares? It's gonna affect what, maybe less than 10% of the market. If rates are in the 3s and 4s, that's great. My first house, Jimmy Carter, 17.5%, 30-year fixed, 1980, baby. Doesn't get any better than that. And these people barking about 5%, I want to slap them. But with all that being said, guys, I think our group here at CTAR is great. The support we get from them is great. You guys have been great through the pandemic. I'll be honest with you, man, we've done well. And I appreciate the heck out of you guys. Guys, again, if you need the lien searches or if you need me to come to your office to do a contracts class, I'm all about, like CTAR is, I want to help you. I don't care if you're doing closes with me. I appreciate it. But if you're not, I'm still going to come and teach you a class. I'm still going to do your lien searches. We're trying to make it better for you. Joe taught a class yesterday, a great class. Let us know, man. That's what we're all about. I mean, I love your business, but even if I'm not doing it, I'm still going to help you, okay? So you guys have a good one, and y'all can stay here, and I'm going home. Be good. Thank you. Be good, guys.
Woo! Mark, your mask. I know you want this, don't you? That's okay. There you go. I'm sure glad I spoke before him because I wouldn't have wanted to follow that. So, wow. But thank you, Mark, as always. Big thank you again for all of our sponsors that are supporting us this year as well. Before I thank another group that's here, I wanted to also say that was a good lead-in to if you are here this morning and you are one of the staff members at CTAR, would you please stand so we can recognize you? There you go. It's Claire, Arthur. Thank you all so much for what you guys do. We appreciate that. We wouldn't have any of this without this. Yesterday when I came here to practice and just make sure everything worked, it was amazing all the things that go into getting an event like this together, and so I just wanted to make sure that you all recognize them. Also, if you are a current or past board member, you serve on either the CID, the MLS, or the Realtor board, please stand up and be recognized as well. Thank you all for your service. Really appreciate it. We got some great folks on the board this year, and I'm really looking forward to working with everybody. It's going to be great. So, another group of people that are sitting in the front of this room are our RPAC major investors. That means that at a level of $1,000 or more, they've invested in RPAC. This is something that's really important. Folks, if you don't know what RPAC is, please make sure there's a booth right out here. It's got a red tablecloth on it with RPAC draped over the front. Check into it. It's amazing what RPAC does for us, and I'd love for you all to be investors if you're not. So, and I am as well. So I do want to make sure I put my money where my mouth is on that. So thank you all to the major investors. If you're a major RPAC investor, please stand. Awesome. Give them a round of applause. Thank you. So this year, CTAR facilitated an exclusive housing study with Andrew Miller, it's the AEG Consulting from Chicago. Here with us to give us more information and introduce the study is CTAR's Government Affairs Director, Josh Dix. Josh?
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. This is a project that we started at the beginning of 2021. This was something that we've been seeing across the region. We were starting to identify that housing inventory is very low. I think all of us know that. Many of our local governments have talked about the issue, but we really haven't come up with a solution-based strategy to address some of these issues. So last year, our board authorized us to go out. We interviewed several different consulting firms, and we ended up picking AEG out of Chicago, Anderson Economic Group. They are headquartered in East Lansing in Chicago. They specialize, a boutique firm, looking at housing and economic policy. They address affordability and attainability which kind of checked all the boxes of what we were trying to accomplish with this study. Andrew Miller, who is about to patch in from Chicago, he was the lead on this project. We worked about 8 months with AEG on this, and we're really excited to introduce this today. We've built today's event around the release of this study, and I don't want to talk much more about it. I want to introduce Andrew and let him lay out the study, and we'll come back a little bit later in the program and talk about it. But everyone, please welcome Andrew Miller from Chicago.
Good morning. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction. Thank you all for having me here today. As Josh mentioned, we spent most of 2021 working on this project, so I'm looking forward to sharing our findings with you all this morning. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, Josh, it looks like you actually might need to enable screen sharing for me to do that. So maybe while I'm waiting to get that screen share capability, I'll just start with a quick introduction to Anderson Economic Group. So, actually it looks like, here we go. Okay, great. So yes, thank you again. Sorry for that brief hiccup. I'm here today to discuss the results of our housing affordability policy study for the Charleston metropolitan area. Just to give a quick rundown of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to myself and Anderson Economic Group. Then I will discuss the purpose of this project. After that, I'll provide an overview of our findings, including both a housing market analysis and the policy evaluation we conducted. And then I'll conclude with a summary of our work. So to start with an introduction to AEG, we were formed in Michigan about 25 years ago, and since then have become one of the nation's premier boutique consulting firms, advising businesses, governments, and nonprofits from across the country from our offices in Michigan and in Chicago. This slide is just meant to provide a brief sampling of the kinds of clients we work with. Again, as I mentioned before, we work with all different sectors, all different types of organizations, ranging from large companies like Ford and GM to universities like Michigan State and the University of Michigan, to trade associations like Chambers of Commerce and the National Association of Realtors. And this map just gives you a sampling of where in the country we work. Many of our projects have been in the Midwest, where we're headquartered, as well as in the Northeast. But we have worked in almost every state over the past quarter century. We do a lot of different types of economic and policy analysis. And one of the areas that we specialize in is housing market analysis and housing policy analysis. We've conducted a number of studies over the last several years. A few that I have participated in personally include a recent study on the impact of metropolitan districts on housing costs in Colorado, a housing affordability study in the city of Akron, Ohio, and an analysis of lead-safe ordinances in Philadelphia and in Cleveland. We've also done a number of other projects, including studying first-time homebuyer safety in the states. And so I'm a consultant in the public policy and economic analysis practice area at AEG. I'm based in our Chicago office. As I was just mentioning, I've worked on a number of our housing market and housing policy studies, and I also specialize in economic and fiscal impact analysis and tax and regulatory analysis. So moving on to the purpose of this project, why we're here today. So the Charleston Trident Association of Realtors retained AEG to conduct a study of housing affordability and housing policy in the Charleston metro area. So just to talk briefly about why the study was needed, as Josh was alluding to earlier, I have a couple slides that cover some of our findings on housing costs in the Charleston metro area. This first one covers rents over the past decade. I'm showing several different sources for rent data here, since those sources tend to vary in their rent estimates. And these numbers are different for these different sources, but one thing they all share in common is a pattern of steadily rising rents over the past decade in the Charleston metro area. And with the Zillow and apartment list rent indices, there is a particularly large increase in rent in 2021. Since we just talked about rents, I wanted to talk about home sale prices as well. So we analyzed data that was provided to us by the Association of Realtors, and we looked at both the metro-wide median sale price, which is the dark blue, and we also looked at the median sale prices for the three most populous municipalities in the metro area, the city of Charleston, North Charleston, and Mount Pleasant. And again, these numbers for each of these lines are different, but the pattern is the same across all of them. Over the past decade or so, we've seen a steady increase in the median sales price, with a particularly noteworthy increase in 2021. So we know that housing costs are rising. How has that impacted housing affordability? So this chart is meant to get at this question of how affordable is housing in the Charleston metro area. And we use the term cost burden here, which refers to whether a household is paying more than 30% of their household income towards their housing costs. And that's a federal definition that tries to pin down what affordability means. And so this chart is showing two different time periods. In the dark blue, we have 2005 to 2010. In the light blue, we have 2014 to 2019. And that's showing the percentage of households that are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs by income bracket for those two different time periods. And so what we can see is that for these middle income brackets, households earning between $20,000 on the low end and $75,000 on the high end here, they have actually seen higher rates of people paying more than 30% of their income on housing. In other words, housing affordability has decreased for these households in these income brackets. We can see that's particularly the case for households earning $35,000 to $50,000 per year. In the 2005 to 2010 time period, 39% of those households were paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. In the 2014 to 2019 time period, that was 48%, nearly half of households in that income bracket paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So the purpose of our report was to identify housing policy proposals that show promise to address this issue of housing affordability that's becoming increasingly pressing in the Charleston metro area. So what we did was we did a review of all types of policies that have been experimented with across the country, and then we evaluated those policies both in terms of feasibility and for their capacity to make a meaningful impact on housing affordability and youth. So I'm going to move on next to an overview of our findings. So we took 3 steps as we were working on this study. First of all, we conducted an analysis of the Charleston metro area housing market so we could get a good baseline for what's going on in the region right now. Next, as I mentioned, we reviewed a wide range of housing policy proposals and case studies from cities across the United States. And then finally, after we narrowed down that list of housing policy proposals, we evaluated them in terms of their feasibility. In other words, how likely is it that they could actually be implemented, and in terms of their potential impact on the housing supply. So starting off with the housing market analysis portion of our work, I've already showed you a couple charts from that section of our study, and I'm going to show you a couple more right now. So this is another way to look at housing affordability using that same definition of 30% of income being paid towards housing costs. So in 2019, there were 76,000 households in the Charleston metro area that were classified as housing cost prudent. The dark blue is showing the number of owner-occupied households that were cost burdened. The light blue is showing renter households. You can see in 2019, there were more cost burdened renter households than owner households. And at first glance, it looks like things are improving compared to 2010. However, I'd point out that 2010 was in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And actually, while we've seen a significant decrease since then in the number of owner households that are cost burdened, the number of renter households that are cost burdened in the light blue has only decreased slightly. If you look further back at the year 2000, you can see that there are actually 30,000 more households considered cost burdened in Charleston in 2019 than there were 20 years ago. And so it's really important to think about that as well over the past 20 years, just how much housing affordability has decreased in the region. The next slide is looking in a little more focused way at the housing supply in the Charleston metro area. So what this chart is showing is the owner-occupied housing supply in terms of months of supply of homes on the market. And it's comparing that to the median sale price using data that was provided to us by the Charleston Trident Association of Realtors. And what you can see is it's the same pattern that sort of emerges again and again from these charts, which is over the past decade or so, we see a steady decrease in supply and a steady increase in the median sale price. And just like in those other charts, we see that pattern really grow even more sort of exacerbated since the onset of the pandemic. You see a pretty big, rapid increase in median sale price and a very steep decline in the months of supply of homes on the market. And so if we think about 6 months of supply right up here as being sort of an industry standard, you can see that the region's housing market has been below that since at least 2018 or 2019, and it's been significantly below that as of the first half of 2021. And just to put some numbers on this chart, home sale prices rose 12.5% in the first 6 months of 2021. Rents rose by about 14% in the same time period. So there certainly seems to be an issue with supply that may be contributing to increased housing costs. So next I'm going to move on to our policy evaluation. We took 3 key steps. We identified 3 key steps to improving housing affordability in the Charleston region. The first was building capacity to advance housing affordability. The second was increasing funding for affordable housing. And the third was allowing for greater residential density. So I'm going to talk about each of these sections in a little bit more detail. So capacity building was the first step that we identified. And there are 2 main pieces here. The first is building greater regional collaboration across the metro area to advance both advocacy for affordability, but also just greater awareness and greater access to technical expertise to make housing affordability happen. So what some other metro areas across the country have done is build formal partnerships of different stakeholder governments and other entities. They've created dashboards. They've distributed technical information to help advance knowledge needed to meet affordable housing goals. And we believe that that's an opportunity to increase housing affordability in the Charleston region by improving that regional collaboration. Another one is streamlining local regulatory processes for developers, particularly for affordable housing developments. So some areas have separate, streamlined, expedited processes for building permits and other aspects of regulatory process for building affordable housing specifically, sometimes combined with lower fees. And there are a number of similar policies like that that have been enacted across the country that could improve capacity to build more affordable housing in the Charleston region. The next sort of area, the next big step for improving housing affordability has to do with housing market regulations, most of which have to do with residential density. So we identified several specific policy changes. One had to do with accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, expanding their use in the Charleston region, taking a look at best practices to determine how the largest number of ADUs possible can be built, and making those accessible to the families that are interested in them. The next was strategic upzoning. So thinking about areas where it makes sense to allow more than just single family homes, understanding that there's a big demand for housing in the region, and that restrictions on multifamily housing, even very small multifamily buildings like duplexes, can further constrain supply. Next was transit-oriented development, looking ahead to the Low Country Rapid Transit bus rapid transit system in the Charleston region, and thinking about how to enact policy change to make sure that housing development is maximized to meet future demand along that route. And finally, revisiting roofs, specifically in the city of Charleston, to boost affordable housing there. And this is just an example to give you a taste of what you can see in the report. This is an example of the type of analysis that we did on these housing market regulations. This is a map showing existing zoning in the city of Charleston within a quarter mile of the Low Country Rapid Transit line. And this is just showing that there are certainly opportunities where there are residential parcels that are currently zoned for single family only in an area that's going to see an increase in demand once the transit line is complete, as well as parcels that are not zoned for residential at all that may be good opportunities for mixed use development in the future. The next main step had to do with funding and land asset management, resource management overall. So a few of the things we looked at in our report were the establishing a housing trust fund to provide a big influx of funding to build affordable housing in the region. The next was establishing a region-wide land bank to try to return residential parcels that are vacant to productive use. And finally, exploring a short-term rental tax to help generate some new revenue to build affordable housing in the region. So again, here's another example of the kind of work you can see in our study. This one dovetails nicely with the previous couple slides because it also relates to the future bus rapid transit line in the region. So this map in red is showing the planned route at this point in time. And then it's showing all of the vacant residentially zoned parcels as of 2015, the last year for which that data was publicly available. In orange, you can see privately owned vacant residential parcels, and in purple, you can see publicly owned vacant parcels, which may provide opportunities for public-private partnership to build affordable housing along the transit line in the future. I want to just briefly conclude with some final thoughts. So I'm not going to go through each of these numbers in detail, but I did just want to share this table shows sort of the final summarized results of our study, looking at all of the different types of policy changes that we identified as most promising, identifying what the implementation barriers are, as well as the rough magnitude of the impact in terms of the number of units that could be added to the local housing supply. Thinking both about new market rate units as well as new affordable, that is to say, rent or income restricted units. And just because there are implementation barriers here doesn't mean a policy shouldn't be pursued. It's just important to understand if a policy is going to take a lot of effort or a lot of political capital or a lot of time to get implemented, it's important that that policy is also going to have a large enough impact, a large enough return on investment for that effort. And generally what we've seen in the policies that we identified here is that we looked at policies that may have had higher implementation barriers in terms of feasibility, but those same policies also had a greater potential for impact in terms of the number of units added. And as you can see at this table, which you can explore in more detail in our report, there is a pretty big variety from policy to policy in terms of both implementation barriers and potential impact. Overall, all of these policies taken together could add thousands of new units to the housing supply over the next 5 years or so. And so just to leave you with some key takeaways, housing costs are rising and affordability is a growing issue in the Charleston metro area. Policy changes and new funding could increase the affordable housing stock. And the policy proposals that we identified in our study vary in their feasibility and in their potential impact. That's all I have for you today. Thank you again for inviting me to share the results of this study with you. We were excited to have this opportunity, and we hope it contributes to efforts to improve housing affordability in the Charleston metro area in the coming years. If you have any questions, Josh has offered to get those questions from you and share them with us, and we'd be happy to try to answer them. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Just give it up. So it's my pleasure now to welcome our keynote speaker. We're welcoming back the expert economist who has joined us for our last few market updates and knows our market well. Dr. Joey von Nessen is here with us again today to share his knowledge about the trends in the global, national, and local economic and real estate markets that affect all of our businesses. Dr. von Nessen is a research economist in the Division of Research at the Moore School of Business, where he conducts economic impact analysis, forecast, survey research, and other applied work involving regional economic modeling. Dr. von Nessen also specializes in housing economics and residential real estate and provides economic and marketing research to clients in both private and public sector. He regularly speaks to businesses and government leaders throughout the state of South Carolina. Now, Joey's going to speak for about a total of 40 minutes, but the last probably 5 or so minutes of that is going to be for us to ask some questions. So pay attention, and I welcome to the stage Dr. von Nessen.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all again for inviting me to be with you this morning. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly faces in person. It's a welcome change as we head into 2022, and it's always a pleasure to be a part of this event every year. So I want to start by saying thank you and to reiterate how much of a pleasure it is to be a part of this group and this event every year. Again, my name is Joey von Nessen, and I am a research economist with the Darla Moore School of Business, where we conduct applied economic research, and I always like to say we do so what economics. I like to use that term, meaning we're always looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? How do these data apply? How do these help? How do these data help different groups and individuals and businesses make strategic decisions? And of course, the first step in making a strategic decision is understanding the market landscape, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The changes that we've seen in the South Carolina and U.S. economies over the past 18 months or so, where we are today in January of 2022, and where we're headed as we move forward into 2022 with respect to our local economy and, of course, with respect to housing markets in particular. And as we get things started, I think it's important to really frame where we are relative to the trends of the last decade or so. What makes the last 18 months different, and where are we today? And I think a helpful way to think about this is to consider that we really hit the pause button on a decade-long expansion, if we think about it, in early 2020. Because right before the pandemic began, in February of 2020, we were coming off of a decade-long economic expansion, about 128 months of consecutive economic growth in the United States, going all the way back to the summer of 2009. And that expansion ended, as we all know, because of the pandemic, which makes it very unique, makes that recession very unique, because it was ended by an external factor that had nothing to do with the economic fundamentals of the economy, which at the time were very strong. Because, of course, as we all know, it was the result of an imposed government shutdown. And so what that meant was that when the economy reopened, the economic fundamentals were in place so that we could see much more rapid recovery than we would normally expect following a standard economic recession. So the conditions were very, very different going into the pandemic. The end of the previous expansion and the recession itself was caused by a very different factor than we'd seen before. And so that influenced the pace of recovery. And we can actually see that very clearly as we look at the recovery path over the last 18 months or so. So this graph here just gives you an illustration of the difference between the recovery that we saw following the Great Recession in 2008 and what we've seen over the last 18 months or so. So in red there, you can see that it took us a full 6 years in South Carolina to recover all of the employment losses that were incurred following the financial crisis in 2008. By contrast, we're now already within 2% of our pre-COVID employment levels, where we were back in February of 2020. So this has really been a V-shaped recovery pattern that the South Carolina economy has seen over the last 18 months or so. Very, very different from what we saw following 2008, and indeed, also with respect to most previous recessions, simply because the causal factors were so different. And so what that means is that as we enter 2022, this is really a silver lining to the government shutdown in the sense that we've been able to recover much quicker as the economy has reopened. And in a real sense, we are on the verge of being able to push the play button on that great expansion once again. So if we think about the expansion over the past decade, the economy being in very good shape going into 2020, hitting pause, and then this 18 months of recovery, and we're now in a position where we're able to resume economic activity at the levels that we had seen previously. And I'm going to show you some data for this to illustrate that by most economic metrics, South Carolina has either fully recovered or mostly recovered from the losses that we incurred during the pandemic, during that government shutdown in 2020 between about February and April, that 60-day period. And we're essentially off to the races again in 2022. Now, where is the evidence for this? How can we see this specifically? Well, we can break down the market. Economists always like to break down the market in terms of supply and demand, right? We get down to the fundamentals. We want to get down to the basics and really examine what the economy looks like on both sides of the equation here. So first, let's talk about supply. Let's talk about the supply side and the recovery that we have seen in the supply side of the economy, specifically with respect to labor supply. Because as we all know, labor supply has become an important discussion surrounding the labor shortage that we are all familiar with, that we see all over South Carolina, all over Charleston, and indeed all over the United States. So if we look at labor supply and look at employment trends, this is a similar snapshot to the graph I just showed you, but focused more specifically just on this employment recovery that we've seen since 2020. And you can really get a good feel for how far we fell in South Carolina and how much recovery that we've seen. So you see the dramatic decline in jobs in between February and April of 2020, followed by that V-shaped recovery pattern where we saw a very strong market recovery throughout 2020 and into 2021. And then in more recent months, you can see how that recovery has leveled out. So we've seen more slow and steady job growth throughout 2021. And that is what we want to see. We want to see very steady recovery and very steady gains as we move forward. And in the aggregate, when we put it all together, as you see here, we are still down about 1.7%, but we have recovered a majority of the jobs that we have lost. So we're in striking distance of pre-pandemic employment levels in South Carolina. So this is very positive news, a very fast recovery, and indeed a V-shaped recovery pattern that we've seen in South Carolina as a whole. We could also break this down at the industry level and get a feel for what this looks like for different major industry sectors in South Carolina. And many sectors have actually fully recovered. So most industry sectors have either fully recovered or have come close to full recovery within about 2 percentage points. And I'm not going to go through each industry here, but this just gives you a feel of where the recovery status sits for each of the major industry sectors in South Carolina. So the percentage at the top of each bar there just represents the employment levels today relative to where they were back in February of 2020. And if it says 100%, that means at least 100%. In most cases, the actual employment levels are above where they were before the pandemic began. So as you can see, 2 major sectors, construction, of course, we see higher employment levels today. The other major sector that has seen the most growth is the logistics sector. Of course, not surprising given that more people have been staying home, working from home, and buying goods online from Amazon and Walmart and others. And so if we think about the logistics sector as a catch-all term for everything related to transportation and distribution and warehousing, right, all of those jobs have seen a significant uptick, and demand has seen a significant uptick over the last 18 months or so. So again, most industry sectors are within striking distance of pre-pandemic levels of employment. Some sectors have already made it. The one key exception, though, of course, is leisure and hospitality, which you can see is still about 9 percentage points away. But even in this case, we've seen very strong recovery of leisure and hospitality throughout 2021. And the reason they're so far behind everybody else is because they fell so much harder. They lost 50%, literally half of the jobs in leisure and hospitality were wiped out in South Carolina between February and April of 2020. So they had a much deeper hole to climb out of following the reopening of the economy in April of 2020. And so they're still a bit behind. But nevertheless, they've seen strong growth throughout this year as well, moving in the right direction. Some other measures of the supply side of the economy and the labor market. We can look at unemployment insurance claims in South Carolina. This is a measure of the number of unemployed people, the number of workers who are being laid off, and the numbers who are staying out of work for an extended period of time. And if we look at initial claims and continued unemployment insurance claims, by both metrics, as you see here, levels are now below the levels that they were at in February of 2020. So initial claims are below where they were in February of 2020. Initial claims meaning or being a representation of the number of newly laid off people when they go in to the Department of Employment and Workforce to file for an unemployment insurance claim for the first time. So these initial claimants representing newly laid off people. Again, levels below where they were in February of 2020. And then the other measure here is continued claims, meaning people who file more than once. So this is more of a broad measure of total unemployment in South Carolina, people that file for unemployment on a regular basis while they are looking for work. Again, by this metric as well, below where it was in February of 2020. So back to much more healthy labor market metrics when we look at unemployment insurance claims. And then we can look at more traditional measures of the labor market in South Carolina. Everybody, of course, familiar with the unemployment rate, perhaps the most cited statistic when looking at labor markets, either locally or nationally. And this just tracks the unemployment rate in South Carolina over time, again, going back to pre-pandemic levels of unemployment. And you can see that we peaked at 11.5% in April of 2020 and have had a steady decline since then. And unemployment in South Carolina currently, as of November, which is the latest month for which we have data, is now at 3.7%, which most economists consider to be at full employment. So we are in a very strong position now in South Carolina, a very strong labor market overall. Not quite down to 2.4%, which is where we were before the pandemic. But in both cases, these are historic lows for South Carolina. 2.4% was the lowest unemployment rate in South Carolina's history when we were there. And we're getting closer and closer to that metric now. So again, unemployment rate, the unemployment rate metric looking very good in terms of a measure of the labor market as a whole. And then finally, we can also look at the size of the labor force itself. And the size of the labor force is the total population that is either working or actively looking for work. And we want to see more people coming back into the labor force, more people looking for work, because workers, as we all know, are so desperately needed right now. And we can see that the labor force, again, fully recovered, and in fact, about 1.7% higher than it was in February, or rather January of 2020. So another measure, thinking about metrics getting back to pre-pandemic norms, getting back to the norms we were at before the pandemic began, the labor market in general is moving in that direction, and the labor force itself is significantly elevated from those pre-pandemic norms back in January of 2020. So the labor force moving in the right direction itself. And this is actually fairly unique for South Carolina, because in most states, this is not the case. The labor force is still significantly depressed compared to January of 2020. We're only one of 12 states that has seen a full recovery of the labor force itself. So we can actually map this out and just look at where South Carolina stands relative to the nation as a whole. You can see the other 11 states where the labor force has fully recovered. And in fact, we're the only state in the Southeast where this is true, except for Florida. And so that begs the question as to why, of course, what's going on in South Carolina that's different. And one of the major causal factors is actually population growth, which of course is benefiting South Carolina as a whole and Charleston in particular. So we have people moving into the region at a very rapid pace, and many of those people are joining the labor force and going to work. So population trends are really on our side in South Carolina, and is one reason why we're very bullish about the overall outlook for South Carolina and for Charleston going forward. And I'm going to come back in a few minutes and talk a little bit more about population trends. But this is one of the major reasons why South Carolina has been doing well. Now, this also begs another question, which is, if this is the case, and if the labor force is actually higher than it was back in February of 2020, before the pandemic began, and we're seeing this great population growth, why is it the case that we're seeing help wanted signs all over the place? Right? What are we missing here? What's going on if the labor force is looking so good and the labor market is looking very strong right now? What's the missing piece here? What's the missing piece of the puzzle? And the answer is demand. We haven't talked at all about demand yet. So now let's shift gears a little bit and move from the supply side of the equation, particularly labor supply, and let's talk a little bit more about what's going on the demand side of the equation, and look at overall consumer demand and demand in the aggregate for the US and South Carolina economies. And we can start by doing that through looking at GDP growth, which is the best measure that we have for the overall growth rate of the US economy, driven by demand and by consumer demand in particular. And here we can just look at the metrics of GDP growth that we've seen recently, and this allows you to put it in context with growth rates over the last several years. You can see here the most recent rate of GDP growth that we have, 2.3%. And when all is said and done, we don't have the final estimates for 2021 yet, but we expect that growth will come in for the year. US GDP growth will have been about 6%. Plus or minus, so give or take, but right around 6% for 2021. And we expect that to taper off to about 4% in 2022. And that's normal. That's what we would expect to see, because 2021, we saw high growth because it was a major recovery year, as we all know. And as we settle back down and get closer to a steady state, long-run rate of growth, which is what we want to see, that's why growth is going to taper off to closer to 4% in 2021, based on current expectations. Again, hitting that play button, right? Moving back to the great expansion and the economic conditions that we had seen over the previous decade before COVID really hit us. So 2.3% is our latest estimate of GDP growth. We can also zoom in a little bit on South Carolina and get a feel for what GDP activity looks like in our state. And here, once again, if we look at overall GDP levels, once again, you can see that we are recovering and getting back to levels of pre-pandemic norms. Again, pushing that play button on the great expansion. So here we can see GDP levels in the aggregate for South Carolina, and just putting a line there just to highlight where we are today compared to where we were before the pandemic began. Again, you can see in 2021, that's where we finally recovered, and we've now surpassed pre-pandemic levels of economic activity in South Carolina. So GDP today higher. The total size of South Carolina's economy is now larger than it was before the pandemic began. And even if we look at trends, we get a similar picture. So instead of looking at the aggregate level comparison there, let's put in a trend line and just look at our overall growth patterns. And you can see, once again, we're back on track with what we would otherwise expect. If we were back in 2018 or 2019 and we're trying to forecast GDP in 2021 or 2022, and we were just doing a simple forecast based on a trend line, we'd be pretty close, right? So we're pretty close in terms of what we would have expected if not for the pandemic. So again, we are back on pace with what we would otherwise expect pushing play on this expansion once again as we move into 2022. So very good news for South Carolina as a whole. Now, let's look a little bit more at consumer spending itself. We talked about this labor shortage, and we want to think about why this is such a challenge, what the causal factors are in the US and in South Carolina. And a lot of it comes down to this elevated level of consumer spending. So if we zoom in on the types of GDP or the factors of GDP that go into measuring overall economic activity, consumer spending is the biggest piece of the puzzle, or the biggest piece of the pie. So about 70%, 70% of GDP comes from this consumer spending variable. So it's the most important factor that we want to look at when examining GDP over time. And we can do that. We can zoom in and look just at consumer spending. And here you can see the trends over the last several years. You can see the dip in 2020 and the recovery as well. And notice that when we put in a trend line here, again, just like looking at trends from GDP growth for South Carolina overall, you can see where we would normally expect to be because the growth rate in consumer spending is pretty consistent over time. It's very stable. And you can see that we are significantly elevated above where we would have expected the US economy to be if the pandemic had not occurred. We're about 4.4% above trend. That's a significant bump for consumer spending. So this is driving a very high level of demand in the US economy right now. And it looks even higher if we don't compare where we are today with where we would expect to be today, but if we instead compared where we are today compared to where we were in February of 2020. Because if we do that comparison, the difference is even more dramatic. And so we can look at a graph of that here. You can see we're actually 11% above the levels of consumer spending that we were at in February of 2020, just before the pandemic began. Now, let's compare supply and demand. So look at demand being elevated basically 11% compared to where we were in February of 2020, and look at employment levels at the South Carolina level and at the US level. We're approaching pre-pandemic employment levels. We're not quite there yet, but even if we were all the way back in terms of employment, there's still a major, major difference here between where we are in employment levels compared to February of 2020 and where we are in consumer spending. So a major mismatch between supply and demand. So that's why we can see employment recovery that's progressing very, very nicely, and yet we see help wanted signs all over the place because businesses are reacting to this increase in demand, right? So they are seeing this uptick in demand and they're trying to satisfy that demand, and so they need more workers. And I think the best way to really encapsulate this is to provide a quick example and just to think about an individual business, right, that might have been operating at a certain level of capacity. Let's say they've got operating at full capacity in blue there on the left side of your screen, right, 100% capacity. And then the pandemic hits them and they lose the gray level of activity. But then we see this recovery that occurs in 2020 and 2021. And so what businesses are thinking is, not only do I as a business have to get back all the employees I lost in order to meet demand in gray there, but now I need even more employees to capture this additional demand in green that I didn't have before, right? So it's simply a mismatch between supply and demand. Employment growth is looking good, but it's just not enough right now to keep up with demand. And so as a result, again, we see help wanted signs and we see labor shortages across most industry sectors, which is certainly true in South Carolina and in Charleston, and is true to a large extent across the US as well. So this ongoing mismatch between supply and demand. Now, that begs the next question. Why is consumer spending so high? What is different? What's driving this trend? Why has demand been so high over the last 18 months or so during this recovery period? And the answer is what I like to call a caffeine high that we've been going through and that we have not really come down off of yet due to the federal stimulus that we have seen over the last 18 months. As we all know, trillions of dollars have been pumped into the national economy in terms of stimulus overall in order to help prop the economy up and to keep it moving while the economy was shut down and in the aftermath of the early parts of the recovery. And this has taken many forms. This has taken the forms of stimulus checks. It's taken the forms of child tax credits. It's taken the form of extended unemployment insurance benefits and higher benefits. And this has all been geared towards helping keeping the economy going throughout 2020 while it was recovering, particularly during the high periods of unemployment. But as a result of that, we've seen very high levels of demand that have come about, particularly as we've seen employment recovery. And so we're now in a situation where demand is being driven not only by individuals spending their wages that they're now earning, because we see the labor market in a very positive environment right now, or a positive place, but also those stimulus dollars are also being spent. And so you put those two together and you see very high levels of demand, or what I call really a caffeine high that the US economy has been on, and now it's starting to begin to wear off. Now we can see this explicitly in the data. Over the last year or so, as we've seen these stimulus dollars go directly to Americans and go directly to the pocketbooks of Americans. We see this in terms of disposable personal income, which has been significantly elevated over historic norms. Again, think about these trends over time, very stable trends in general in terms of growth patterns. And you can see, following the beginning of the pandemic, a radical departure from previous norms, again, because of these stimulus dollars, disposable income going up. We're still above trend, about 2.6%. And this means more money for Americans to use, and they are spending that money in the economy, and we're seeing elevated demand as a result of that. Notice also that this is coming back down. It's still elevated, but not nearly to the level that it was back in 2020 and early 2021. So we see a bump in disposable income, and now it's beginning to taper back off, right? So it's coming back down. We see a similar pattern if we look at savings rates for Americans as well. So here you can see the personal savings rate tends to be pretty stable over time, but again, significantly elevated following 2020 and into 2021. Now coming back down, still slightly elevated above historic norms, but elevated nonetheless. So by both measures, whether we're looking at disposable income or looking at savings rates, we can see how the stimulus dollars have put the American consumer in a very good financial position. And in fact, we see Americans in better financial shape now than they've been in quite a period of time. So the federal stimulus helping to generate demand and support the demand, and certainly the elevated levels of spending activity that we've seen over the past 18 months or so. So what does this imply for 2022? Well, one thing it implies, as you see here, is that we expect that consumer spending may begin to taper off, because as this federal stimulus works its way through our economy, as it has been in 2020 and 2021, we see that it's going to start to wear off. In fact, it already is. We see disposable income and savings rates slowly coming back down to pre-pandemic norms. And that means that as we move forward, consumer spending is going to be more based exclusively on labor income. It's going to be based off of a strong market, a strong labor market, which is what we want to see. We want to see a market environment that is standing on its own, that's a healthy market environment, and that is reemerging. Again, getting back to this theme of pushing play on a great expansion that we were in up through 2020. So this is actually a good thing. So consumer demand tapering off a bit in 2022. We're not talking about any type of decline, just getting back to more pre-pandemic norms with respect to long-run growth trends. So one expectation that we are looking at as we move into 2022. All right, so let's change gears then a little bit and talk more specifically about how this impacts housing markets. So we've talked generally about the supply side of the equation, we've talked about the demand side of the equation, and we've talked about the significant mismatch between the two and how this is explaining why we're seeing such a labor shortage right now, given the fact that labor markets are actually in a pretty good position, that people are coming back to work. COVID, of course, is still part of this. Many people are still not able to go back to work because of health-related concerns. And we see, of course, the Omicron variant that's now making its way through. But more generally, we see a major mismatch between supply and demand that's also a primary factor that's driving a lot of these unusual trends that we're still seeing in the U.S. and South Carolina economies. All right, so let's then talk about housing. What's going on with housing markets and how this influences what's going on in South Carolina and in the Charleston housing market. And we can start out by looking at MLS sales activity and just tracking what the growth has looked like in terms of sales over the last several years. This shows you a rolling 12-month average of sales activity in the Charleston market, just to give you some perspective on where we are today compared to where we've been over the last decade or so. And I'll just put some arrows on this graph. Here we go. And just to give you a sense of how we can really break this down, I think it's helpful to break what's been happening down in terms of growth into 4 phases over the last decade or so, because that gives us some shape and some perspective of how to think about growth rates that we've seen. So if we go back over the last decade, we can see during the early part of the previous decade, of the 2010s, coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, we see fairly high rates of growth. So you can see a somewhat steep slope of that first arrow there that's primarily driven by the fact that we're in recovery mode, right, during the early part of the 2010s, following the 2008 financial crisis. And so we see high rates of growth as we recover. Then beginning in about 2016 to 2017, we see the slope of the line go down just a little bit. So still positive growth, but getting more into a steady state or long-run equilibrium of growth as the process of recovery ended and we hit a genuine economic expansion, where we get to the point where we've recovered most of the losses from the previous recession in 2008, and we chart new waters beginning in, again, the 2016-2017 period. That, of course, then gives way in 2020. We see a very short-term decline, followed by a significant increase in sales, as we're all familiar with, in 2020, which you see here. And then a slight decline beginning in 2021, specifically the second half of 2021. And so it's this last piece that I want to focus on a little bit and get into more detail on. So 4 phases here that we can see, and we can actually look at some specific numbers as well, just to give you a sense of what the specific growth rates look like. So 2021 was by far the best year on record, at least in recent history, for the Charleston market. So we can see sales activity up about 9% compared to 2020 when we look at year over year. And that's coming off of an even stronger year in 2020, about 17% growth overall. But notice also this second bullet point here, that if we just compare the second half of 2021 to the second half of 2020, the story looks a little bit different, down about 7% comparing those 2 time periods. And so the question is, what's going on? What has changed? Are we seeing a tapering off? What has explained this deviation here, and what does that imply for 2022? Well, the major reason that we've seen this pivot in the second half of the year primarily has to do with severe supply constraints. It does not reflect a decline in demand, as you see here in the second bullet point. Demand has not pulled back. So these are both important elements to consider when you're looking at these data, particularly when you start factoring in the tapering off of sales activity in the second half of 2021. It's not a reflection of demand, it's a reflection of the supply constraints that we're seeing. And of course, you're all familiar with this, you see it every day. And we see this in the data very, very clearly. As you see here, pending sales significantly exceeding the number of active listings. This was true last year when we got together, and it is even more true this year. This problem has this has been exacerbated over the last 12 months or so. Inventory levels now in the Charleston market down to about 1 month. We typically think about a quote-unquote normal housing market having inventory levels of closer to 6 months. Now down closer to 1. So again, just different metrics illustrating the fact that supply constraints are still with us and will likely be with us for the foreseeable future, at least through 2022. And this is what's primarily driving this change in sales activity. It's not due to a pullback in demand. Another way that we can see this, looking at the data, is if we look at days on market and the changes that just this one metric has seen in the last year or so. So days on market has been going down significantly, and this has been true at the national level and in South Carolina and in Charleston. And just look at the difference here. So a decline in the average days on market for the U.S., about 26% or so over the last 12 months, but closer to 69% in Charleston. So a major change, right? Just reflecting this supply constraint that we're currently seeing. Now, one other way we can measure these differences in supply and demand, and one other way we can see that this is more of a supply constraint than it is a reflection on changes in demand, is the fact that we're seeing median sales prices go up in Charleston even at a faster pace in 2021 than we did in 2020. And again, we put some historical data in here as well, just tracking the last several years just to put these numbers into perspective. So you can see in 2020, the highest rate of increases in the median sales price that we'd seen in recent years, and that was even topped in 2021, over 15%, about 15.4% overall. And so what does this tell us in terms of the relationship between supply and demand? Well, if we were really seeing a pullback in demand, we would expect that the median sales price would not be increasing, at least not as dramatically as it is shown here, because if sales activity were going down because demand were coming down, we would expect for the median sales price to be leveling off as well, or at least the growth in the median sales price. And that's not happening here. So again, another reflection of the fact that the sales activity changes that we're seeing reflect more supply constraints than it says anything about a pullback in demand. And one final way that we can look at this, just again to give you some perspective on the changes in pricing in the Charleston market, is to look at a distribution by price point. Now, there are a lot of numbers here, so we're not going to go through each one of them, obviously, but I want you to pay attention just to the last row there at the very bottom where the arrow is, because what this shows us is the distribution of sales by price point. So that last row shows the percentage of sales in the Charleston market for each year going back to 2011 that sold for more than $500,000. And you can see that's been, as you would expect, steadily ticking upwards over time. But as we've highlighted in yellow here, you can see that the increase between 2016 and 2021 over the past 5 years, far higher than it was in the previous 5 years, between 2011 and 2016. So again, we can measure the median price increases in a variety of ways, but this is a way you can see it more clearly, looking specifically at different price points, and in this case, looking at the 500,000 plus price point level in the Charleston market. All right, so what does this imply about 2022? What can we expect going forward? Looking at the economy as a whole, looking at what's been going on in the Charleston housing market, what does that tell us about this year coming up? What can we say? Well, the bottom line here, as you see, is that we expect for the pace of sales growth to continue to soften, but prices will likely remain elevated going forward. So we are getting back to a point where we're looking at a steady state of growth, again, transitioning back towards an expansion, a more normal expansion, where we see more normal rates of growth compared to the wild swings that we had seen in 2020 and 2021. And why is it the case that we expect a bit of a tapering off of sales activity? That's because if we look at what drives housing demand, some of the factors that were there previously won't necessarily be with us in 2022, at least not to the same extent. And this gets back to some of the factors we were talking about before. So 4 major drivers of demand in 2021. The 2 biggest were employment recovery and employment growth overall, population growth, which of course contributes significantly to demand as people are moving into the area, fiscal stimulus, which we talked about, and also historically low interest rates. All of those were driving very high levels of demand in 2021. And as we move into the new year, we're going to see less and less demand driven by federal stimulus. And as we already heard alluded to before, we are expecting to see interest rates rise in 2022, and that will impact housing affordability? Not much. We're talking about very small rates of increases for interest rates. But on the margin, it will have an impact, which is why we put a question mark there too. Interest rates will remain low by historic measures, but again, slightly elevated from where we've seen previously. So 4 major factors of demand being reduced somewhat in 2022, which is why we expect demand to taper a bit. And then looking more generally at 2022, what are other factors that we need to be considering, that you all need to be monitoring? In the short run, in South Carolina, we see high inflation as the biggest economic threat for South Carolina in 2022. But the biggest long-run threat, or the long-run challenge, has to do with these ongoing labor shortages. And one of the things that is important to recognize is that these ongoing labor shortages is not something that's going to be solved in 2022. This is going to be likely a bottleneck for growth on South Carolina for the foreseeable future, probably for the bulk of the 2020s. So this is going to be a challenge we're going to continue to face in South Carolina. So just a couple of quick comments on both of these elements. First, if we look at inflation, why is that a threat in 2022? One reason is that it's already having practical implications for South Carolinians. If we look at wage data across industry sectors, what we've found is that about 40% of the South Carolina workforce has seen an erosion of their purchasing power in the last year because of the high rates of inflation that we've been experiencing in the United States. So some sectors have seen extraordinary wage growth that has more than offset any increases in inflation, but many workers have not. And again, about 40% of workers have seen a loss in purchasing power. And that matters. That matters for the health of the economy. It matters for individual South Carolinians. And so as the Fed takes more proactive measures to respond to elevated inflation, they have to do so in a measured way, because as you can see here, raising interest rates can impact the momentum of the economic recovery that we see. So we're going to be monitoring very carefully what the Fed looks to do, how quickly they look to raise interest rates, because it's important that we balance the economic recovery with responding responsibly to inflation, recognizing that inflation does pose a challenge for the U.S. and for South Carolina, and that the Fed needs to take a proactive approach in addressing that concern. And then secondly, looking at this labor shortage, is this the new normal? And as I alluded to already, I think the answer to that question is yes, this is the new normal. This is going to be a challenge for the U.S. and especially for Charleston and in South Carolina for the foreseeable future. And we can see this primarily if we look at population trends. And Charleston is benefiting greatly from population growth, as you all know, and this is a boom for demand. And it's great news for the housing market, generally speaking, in Charleston and in South Carolina more generally. This gives you one way to see the population gains that South Carolina has been experiencing relative to other regions of the country. If we look over the past decade, South Carolina is actually ranked 3rd in terms of its net migration ranking. As I mentioned before, South Carolina ranked 2nd in terms of the rate of population growth in 2020. 2nd behind Idaho, believe it or not, of all states. And we can maybe talk about why during the Q&A period. But yeah, so South Carolina very much benefiting from population immigration, and Charleston being the primary recipient or the beneficiary of that immigration. Great for demand overall. So that's the good news, but that actually contributes to an increasing worker deficit and makes it more of a challenge, makes this labor shortage more of a challenge in South Carolina and in Charleston than in most other parts of the country. Why? Because a majority of the people moving in are not of primary working age. Most of them are over the age of 55. We estimate about 2 in 3 are. So just think about this from a very basic standpoint. Imagine 3 new people moving into South Carolina. All 3 of them are going to be home buyers, potential home buyers. All 3 of them are going to be consuming goods and services. But only one of them, on average, is going to be planning to work for any extended period of time. So that's going to make this supply and demand mismatch even greater over time. So that's why we can see that demand is going to be strong, that this is, again, good news for housing markets for demand purposes, but it does create a challenge for workforce needs going forward. And again, I reiterate that this is going to be likely the major bottleneck on growth for the next decade, and the major challenge that South Carolina faces and needs to be proactive in order to effectively respond. But these trends do mean that we're going to see what I would call a soft landing to the current housing bubble that we are in. There's no question, if we look at various measures, we saw a peak in sales activity and demand in 2020 and 2021. We're coming off of that. We're coming off of that bubble, but it is a soft landing. We expect demand to taper in 2021, but when we say taper, we mean get back to a more healthy, normal rate of growth over time, back to pre-pandemic norms. And that's a good thing as we move forward. So a soft landing to some of the unusual activity that we've seen over the past 18 months. So just wrapping up, the bottom line, South Carolina's economy and Charleston's economy in a very good position. We're seeing most metrics suggest that we are getting back to the normal levels of economic activity that we were at before the pandemic began. If we look at the supply side and the demand side, employment recovery doing well, demand doing well. As we move into 2022, if we look at housing activity, again, we expect for demand to taper off, but to continue to be driven by employment gains and population gains, which are going to be here with us for the foreseeable future, making us optimistic about 2022 overall, and very bullish, as you can see in the final bullet point, on South Carolina as we move forward. So a lot of reasons to be optimistic about South Carolina's growth patterns going forward, benefiting from migration. South Carolina and the Southeast more generally expected to see the highest rates of population growth in the country over the next 20 plus years. So South Carolina in a very good position to take advantage of that from a demand perspective. And of course, we see the industries that are going to be benefiting as well. So the logistics sector, as well as the transformation of advanced manufacturing, puts South Carolina and Charleston in a great position. The threats, inflation, as we mentioned, in 2022, we want to be on the lookout for changes in Fed policy. And of course, this labor shortage is going to be with us for the foreseeable future as well. But generally speaking, we expect a good year for housing in 2022 and are fairly bullish for the next decade for this market. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And we got time for just a couple of questions. And if you do have questions, if you can come down to the microphone, I think we have one in the front here. Okay, yes. No, I'm not going to do that. I could. This is being recorded, right? I probably don't want to dance today.
How you doing? Dan Rivers here. How do you see the end of forbearance affecting some of the data that you've given today?
So can you be more specific?
A lot of the forbearance that's been applied for is now coming to an end, and a lot of banks are either restructuring it or people are going to have to sell their home or possibly go to foreclosure because of it. Do you see that having a high impact on the economy here?
Yeah, so great question. I don't see that. I see that having a marginal effect, but probably not significant, because if we look at the imbalance between supply and demand, it's been so strong that I don't think that that's going to have a meaningful impact on overall trends that we're currently anticipating. So a marginal effect, yes, but a significant impact, probably not. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Kate Compton-LaRoe. My question is about demand on the demand side and parsing the labor market, okay, by demographic, age demographic, as well as manufacturing sector, okay? So you said that, 2 out of 3 would probably not be working.
Yes.
And so therefore that would not increase the demand. I mean, it would increase the demand for housing, but not necessarily in terms of production numbers, okay? But how about the recent trends towards millennials coming into Charleston, okay, as well as the development that's going on in Charleston? So specifically, the biotech development, the plants that are being, you get my point?
Yes. So great question. So where do we see younger workers in terms of their immigration to the state, and what does that impact for industry? Well, one thing that we are seeing is that there are more efforts among industry, particularly R&D and research-related firms and high-tech sectors. They're looking at operating with more partnerships with universities and technical college systems to retain our talent, to bring in additional talent. So they are already recognizing this limitation that we're talking about and taking proactive steps to combat that. And I think one of the strategies that we have to consider from a statewide and a local perspective is ways to match the talent that we have here with demand either locally or demand from around the U.S. Because now that more and more professionals can work from home, that provides an opportunity for South Carolina and in Charleston for us to say, well, you know, this is a great place to live, especially if you can work anywhere. You know, if you can work anywhere and live anywhere, why wouldn't you want to live in South Carolina and in Charleston? And the other fact that we often lose sight of is that while Charleston seems to be an expensive market from our perspective, because we live here every day, from the perspective nationally, it's really not. And so that's a major, major draw around the country. And it's as much of a marketing challenge as anything else, is going out and targeting individuals, bringing them into the state, selling the benefits on Charleston, and also retaining our talent locally. But these businesses and these industries are already doing that, and I think we just have to do more of it, and more businesses and more industries are gonna have to be more and more proactive, and it looks like they're moving in that direction.
So the impact, so as a realtor, speaking as a realtor, not an economist, okay, and looking at the MLS numbers and sort of what's on the, you know, the supply versus demand, what suggestions would you have for us as realtors as we're sort of going through that phase? I mean, certainly marketing is part of it, but also, you know, from a development standpoint, business development standpoint, what kind of suggestions would you have?
Well, you mean suggestions for when you're dealing with customers, potential home buyers, or?
I'm talking about, you know, getting that message out that you're talking about. You know, what really constitutes South Carolina right now, and particularly Charleston. I mean, it's a vibrant scene. There's a lot of young people coming in. There's research, there's development. You know, there's engineering jobs, you know, port development, all those kinds of things. How can we tap into those kinds of
these competitive advantages.
Yeah, those competitive advantages to enhance our business efforts.
Well, I think focusing on the competitive advantages and communicating that and providing opportunities for others to do the same, and to make more parties aware, more organizations aware of the benefits of Charleston, of the Charleston market, for all the reasons that you mentioned. And that's an ongoing process. And I think from a strategic perspective, from the organization perspective, making that case and partnering and communicating with other groups about the advantages of being here and the advantages of moving to the area, and also communicating the importance of retaining our talent here as well, and recognizing the workforce shortage, that this is not a problem that's going away, and that we can appropriately address it. We just have to be proactive about it.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all very much.
Give it up. Good job. As usual, a fantastic job. Thank you so much. You know, it got me to thinking, a lot of us, and don't leave yet, we still got a little bit more to go. So it got me thinking, a lot of us hear the thing about, you know, everybody's moving from Ohio. Do you know that the Chamber of Commerce doesn't even have them in the top 10? How many of y'all knew that? There you go. So anyway, thank you so much, Joey. That was fantastic. Great job. Now, I'd like to welcome those who are participating in our panel discussion to the stage. Leading our panel discussion is a good friend, CTAR and MLS past president, Corwin Millett. Corwin, where are you? Yeah, give it up. I think you got a bigger response than Rusty and me combined. That was really fantastic. Do we have the names? You're going to announce them, aren't you?
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, look here. I appreciate the love, guys. Look here. I say I love realtors, and y'all seem to love me, too. That worked for me. Well, my name is, oh, see, this is perfect. See, this is why, this is the one little thing I miss about being past president, guys. So my name is Corwin Millett. I had the distinct honor of being president of our association in 2014 and president of our MLS in 2019, and I'm so glad to be a past president. So I have the honor today of introducing to you a panel who will talk about that housing study that we just went through a little bit ago. So I have first Ms. Kendra Stewart with the College of Charleston, Joe Riley Institute, and One Region. Y'all please give her a welcome. Next up, Scott Barhight with the Charleston Metro Chamber of Commerce. He is with their advocacy division. And last but not least, Josh Dix, Charleston Trident Association Realtors, our Government Affairs Director. Okay, and also Joey Von Nessen is going to join us as well. Just a quick segue to everybody takes their seat. I've been listening to Joey for years. He has not led us wrong in this market. I'm pretty sure most of you guys can agree with that. So we'll go ahead and get started. Everyone in this room understands the demand on housing. That is our business. That is why we are here. But I want to know, for the good of the group, why is this important to One Region and also the Chamber of Commerce? And Kendra, if you could go first on that.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Good morning. Thank you, or almost afternoon. Thank you for having me here. And I guess I should just briefly explain a moment what One Region is. The role I'm serving right now is chair of the One Region Committee. And One Region is basically a partnership, a public-private nonprofit partnership that's really driven by three core partners in our region: the Charleston Metro Chamber of Commerce, the Charleston Regional Develop Alliance, and the Berkeley Charleston Dorchester Council of Governments. And we, over this past year, have been working on developing a regional plan that is about economic momentum and equity. And so that's all I'll say about it. In a little bit, we'll throw up a QR code so you can learn more if you're interested. And so to address your question about why it's important to One Region is really, it's one of the consistent themes we heard over the past year as we've been developing this plan and doing regional surveys as well as focus groups and a lot of outreach and engagement. So it's on everybody's mind in our region. And it's really a key component of livability in our area. And so you can't be a livable community unless you have a community where everybody has access to things like housing and education. So I'll toss it over to Scott.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to express appreciation on behalf of the Chamber and all of its members for the outstanding partnership that we have with CTAR. We spent a lot of time working together on housing and other issues. And on a personal note, I want to express thanks to you all as realtors. In a past life, I was the outside general counsel for the Greater Baltimore Board of Realtors, and so I have a real fondness for realtors in my heart. So thank you for all the work that you do in our community. The purpose and mission of the Chamber is to encourage the region to benefit a prosperous business environment. We need to do all we can to make sure that the region is prospering and growing. And as you heard from Joey earlier, that cannot happen unless there's adequate housing. So we've spent a lot of time working on the housing issue, and we'll be doing that in the future as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we'll jump straight in. The study says the price of housing has gone up 43% in the last decade, but wages have not kept up this same pace. Do you think this could make us vulnerable for economic development? And we'll start this discussion off with Scott.
Thank you. Well, certainly, and as Joey indicated earlier, it is going to have a drag. on the impacts in the community unless we can identify the appropriate policies to move things forward. Obviously, we're in a competitive environment, not only within the community, but across the United States and in the region. And in order to keep up with that competition, we're going to have to address housing more effectively going forward.
Josh?
Yeah, I think one of the things to also point out is the price of homes for sale has increased 43%. The cost of rents over the last decade has gone up 50%. We are really pricing people out over the last decade. Wages have only gone up 37%. So we're really kind of getting a little lopsided on the housing supply issue and how much people are putting into housing. When we go to chamber meetings, one region meetings, competitive advantage is all we talk about. When we look at peer communities, the Nashvilles, the Austins, those communities are making a real effort to have livable, walkable communities, affordable communities. And if we want those types of jobs that are going to those markets, we need to be a little more nimble and make ourselves a little more attractive in the housing front.
Awesome. Kendra?
Sure, yes. And just to add a little bit onto that, we do know that economic development and recruiting businesses is very much built on the workforce we have here, and as well as the higher education that we offer in universities and colleges. And it's very difficult on that end, of course, we know the workforce challenges, but also to recruit students and serve all types of students if they can't afford to live in a community. And so for One Region, we see this as a real opportunity to address this collaboratively and regionally, to think about these problems as in the Tri-County area rather than, just one siloed area by one.
So Joey?
I would just add to that we, from a competitiveness standpoint and livability, both of those are important. And I would just think about it from the perspective of people looking to move in. And this is such a beautiful area, a beautiful region. But when people are moving in, they're looking for that experience and that businesses want to be able to provide. And just think about the service sector. If the service sector suffers because of a lack of affordability, they can't find workers, they can't move forward, then that affects the quality of life and the competitiveness of the region. So this is going to be more and more of a challenge going forward if we don't address it proactively.
Wow. So next question, the cities of Charleston and North Charleston respectively show that 44 and 45% of its residents spend more than 30% of their income on housing, which obviously we in the industry understand this makes them cost burdened. What do you see as opportunities to address this pressure for the residents of both the city of Charleston and North Charleston? And we will start this one off with Josh.
Well, this is something that we've been looking at for quite some time. I think the biggest opportunity we have stems around low country rapid transit. This is something that One Region and the Chamber, the Realtors, we have all really fully embraced. If you look at North Charleston, they have addressed what we call transit-oriented development, making it more friendly to develop along that line. Having the ridership is going to make sure that line is successful. We need to do the same type of rezoning in the city of Charleston. We may not be able to address wages, but eliminating transportation costs, getting folks living closer to a mobile area, it would be one way to limit some of their housing burden and get them mobile to the job sectors and things like that. The other thing that we'll really be pushing the next couple years is addressing what we call missing middle housing. We are set up for single family or multifamily. There's not a lot of in between. This city was built on duplexes, quadplexes, denser development that fits into the fabric of a neighborhood. I think we talk about that all the time, but we need to get back to where our zoning matches what we are trying to achieve.
All right. Kendra?
Again, to highlight on Josh's point, thinking about this zoning and planning in a regional way, which we have not traditionally done, could really benefit that. The other thing I would point out is that our housing strategies really need to incorporate a two-pronged approach, and that's one, increasing the overall supply that we have, and improving the conditions of the existing stock of housing. The majority of attainable housing in our region does not have rent protections and is highly susceptible to market swings. So those are all challenges that we'll need to address with this.
Scott.
And Corwin, I wanted to come back to the Low Country Rapid Transit. And if you think about the threats that we have and the challenges that we have, it's almost impossible to imagine a solution that wouldn't include something like Low Country Rapid Transit. We are so blessed to have that opportunity going forward. And I'd love to hear Joey talk a little bit about a point that I think is really important to make, is that when public dollars in infrastructure are spent, you'll often see following that 8 to 20 times the private investment that follows. So the BRT line is more than just a line to create transportation. It's the TOD development that's going to come and follow that. It's the investment that's going to occur from the private development community and the business community at large. And again, not being an economist, I don't know those numbers, but I've heard economists talk about anywhere from 8 to 20 times the private investment that will follow those kinds of public investment dollars.
Wow, wow. So Joey, can you add to that?
Well, I think following up on that, and one other point too that I don't think we've heard mentioned yet is fast tracking housing developments workforce housing, so that are in the price points that we're talking about here that are more affordable, and that's another strategy. I think the city is already working on that. They may have implemented that, or that's in the process, but that's another strategy to try and improve the affordability faster with getting through some of that bureaucracy and some of that process. So I agree with everything said, and I think it's focusing more on these different initiatives to move the ball forward.
So that's a perfect segue into the next question for the panel. So with over 76,000 households in the region cost burden, those are those numbers from the study, guys, and the need to create nearly 16,000 affordable units to meet demand, what are you looking at to help ease the strain? And a second follow-up question, how can realtors and business leaders, our business community, make a difference? And we're going to start this one off with Josh.
Well, I think it's a lot of what we've been talking about. There's no silver bullet that's going to address this. Transit-oriented development is a big one. Missing middle is a big one. The streamlining of permits, getting some regulatory enhancements in place. Those are all types of low-hanging fruit that can be short-term and long-term fixes. But we also have to have a conversation with ourselves. It's not just about selling units to prospective buyers or taking care of a seller's need. We have a real inventory issue. We need to engage our membership. This is where I lean on people like you to challenge your colleagues and get engaged in advocacy. Go to your council meetings, talk to legislators about how can we address these problems, because sitting around wanting more inventory isn't going to create more inventory. So we really have to take it upon ourselves and challenge each one of us in the room to go to that next step and make the ask of our elected officials to address these issues.
Scott.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on that theme of activity and engagement that you all can participate in. And there are actually relatively easy and effective ways that you can do that. And part of what we're working on at the Chamber is a regional housing coalition. We haven't had a first meeting yet. We already have 200 people and organizations that have indicated a desire, including CTAR, to participate. If housing is something that's important to you, and we know that it is, look for those opportunities to participate in things like the Regional Housing Coalition to make sure that you and your community and your businesses are properly represented. The last thing that I want to mention is that there's a real disconnect between those of us who understand the need for housing and how important housing is to each of our communities and to business at large, from that opinion and understanding of the common person in the street. We need individually and collectively to communicate to our neighbors and to our friends and our relatives just how important housing is to everyone and how important housing is across all levels of affordability to every community. That's a missing understanding, and we can do that job individually at the dinner table, at the cocktail party, in our churches and synagogues, as well as through collective action. So I think being a part of that public outreach to get that message across of the importance of housing generally is going to be an important part of how we move forward.
Kendra?
And just to build on that, we're going to put up a slide and build on Scott's point and Josh's point of engagement to engage in what we're doing right now with the One Region Plan. As I mentioned, I think we're going to put up a slide. There it is, with a QR code and the website on it. But I mentioned we've gone through a year of public engagement, and we're in the process right now of identifying priorities and strategies for our region to focus on. And I promise that housing affordability will be one of those priorities. In February, we're going to have a public outreach where we share the priorities and the strategies with everyone in our region, and we look for feedback. And we'll have a meeting that, if you're interested, go to the website and sign up, and we'll make sure that you know it'll be a virtual meeting, but you will have the opportunity on your phones or on your computer to look at what's being recommended and to rank those and to provide feedback. So we really hope to get as many people in our region participating in this so that we know what we care about here and what we should invest our time and our money in this region. And I think, you know, again, the issues I think each of you care about will be on there as well. So I encourage you to do that.
Awesome, awesome. And Joey?
I would just add that reaching out to businesses is a very important part of the process. And I look to the success that South Carolina has had with, for example, the technical college system in terms of reaching out to businesses, being proactive and understanding what their needs are, and then meeting those workforce needs, identifying what the skill sets these businesses require, and then helping South Carolinians get trained and being that focal point of matching the potential workers, South Carolinians, with the businesses. That model has been hugely successful. We're one of the best in the country at doing that through the technical college system. And I think building these initiatives to do something similar for housing affordability, because businesses will tell you what they need and what their employees are going to need in order to be successful, in order for them to recruit. So they need to be part of that process, and we can build a similar program that can meet some of these goals.
Awesome, thank you. So the last question from this study for the group: what policy recommendations, do you think we can easily achieve? And then which ones are worthy but may take more time and effort? And we'll start that off with Scott.
Thank you, Corwin. We've already heard a good bit about low country rapid transit, and that's something relatively easy in the sense that in March of this year, we're going to hear whether the Federal Transit Administration is going to put up their half of the money so that we can begin that project. We have every indication that it's going to occur. We're very optimistic, but it's right on our doorstep. So in March, we'll hopefully get the good news, and in the next coming months, we're going to need to work together with the local jurisdictions to make sure that the right TOD policies, zoning and development regulations are in place so that when that public investment comes, there's the policies in place to facilitate that private development dollar that's going to follow.
Kendra?
Sure. In the short term, some of the things we could do is work on upfitting the current affordable housing we have that we know is being challenged because of flooding or other constraints, and rather than letting that just go back to the market and be repurposed into less affordable housing as one thing we could focus on. And second, a shorter term thing or an easier one is using some of the federal funding that our local governments are getting through the CARES Act to focus on housing affordability, because that is an option in one of the categories they could do. So encouraging your local governments to work together and to think collaboratively on how that could be best leveraged is really important. And then longer term, building on that, developing these regional plans for both resiliency in our region and affordable housing, because these are plans, again, that are right now are happening local government by local government, but we need to think more strategically and regionally to really effectively address them.
And if I could take a little bit of liberty, Joey, what do you have for this one?
Well, I can't speak specifically to the nuances of some of the policies that you all are talking about, but I think just more generally making sure that we continue to build awareness about the importance of maintaining Charleston as a competitive region, locally and nationally, and just building on that, because from a market perspective, as an economist, competitiveness and livability are really the two key factors. And I think just building awareness, and that's going to help to have the broader public and legislators and stakeholders in general understand the importance of all these initiatives that we're hearing talked about today.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Josh?
Yeah, I don't want to revisit a lot of the points that we talked about, but some of the near-term things are streamlining the permitting process, working with our local jurisdictions. I think bringing everyone to the table to address that more regional approach. These are things that we can do in relatively short manner. Some of the longer term fixes are going to be upzoning, looking at public-private partnerships. Municipalities own a lot of land. Could we enter into a developer agreement with a low land lease that might help address some of these housing shortfalls that we're seeing? So I think there's a host of things that we can do short and long term, but the rezoning work, we just finished that with the County of Charleston. That was a 19-month project. Yeah, I imagine it'll be about that time for the City of Charleston to rezone. So there's a lot of quick wins, but a lot of long-term wins as well.
So thank you so much, guys, for that information. For you, our membership, guys, this is where we need to get involved and where we need to be a part of what is going on. Long story short, we're ambassadors within our community, and Charleston will not remain the same. It is up to us as ambassadors, as business leaders, to make decisions, to support decisions that will help our community grow and remain prosperous and remain a great place to live. So guys, thank you so much for your time. For our membership, please get educated on what's going on. And if I could, with one other thing, guys, we want you to be like the running joke that's between us. We want you to be like a raccoon that falls out the ceiling in the politician's office so we can get this stuff done the way we need to, all right?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Corwin Millette, for moderating, for Kendra Stewart, Scott Barhight, and Josh Dix, and also for Joey Von Nessen stepping up there at the last minute. We really appreciate it. Are your brains full like mine? That's amazing. A lot of great information. I think it really helps us when we're out there talking with our clients and our customers, people who call us and want to know what's going on in our market. What an amazing thing. This is one of those events that I just will not miss. There's a lot of value, I think, that comes from this. So I would love to thank our speakers and our partners, our sponsors, all the people behind the scenes. And, I forgot to thank all the technical folks that are back here. Thank you guys for making us sound good and look good as well. We appreciate hard work that went into this. And let's give it up, too, for Trident Tech, this beautiful facility they help us use. So thanks again for that as well. So one quick study before I go, I just wanted to share with you guys, and for those of you who've heard me share this before, you can groan later, it's fine. But I read a study the other day where they said for every 3 people, one is incredibly intelligent and absolutely stunningly beautiful, gorgeous, handsome type person. So what I want you to do is look to the person on your left. Just look them over real good, real quick. And then look at the person on your right. Look them up and down, like study them real good. So, and now that you realize it is neither one of them, guess who? Y'all are beautiful people. It's awesome to stand up here and see your beautiful smiling faces. I can see your smiles through your masks, I promise. But we thank you for that. We hope to see you at our next event. And it looks like we are adjourning just a few minutes late. Have a safe day. Be safe out there. Thanks for coming.